So the book of Kings, it tells this story about the time when the prophet Elijah encountered God for himself, face to face, whisper to whisper, soul to soul. I have been trying to do justice to this story in a sermon for 15 years. And I woke up this morning and told my husband, I am not sure I've pulled it off yet again. It's a story that our children hear once every 3 years as a part of our core curriculum of stories that we do in the religious education classes. It's a story, as I said, I've had a shot at in this pulpit before. And it's not that it's more true, more important than any other story. I think the reason we come back to it is because there's something in this prophet's quest to see the holy that is not so different from my life or your life. Not so different from all the things we run away from, and how very hard it has always been for prophets in every age to quiet down the loud voices all around long enough to hear and to share the deepest truths within them. Elijah, like many a prophet before him and since, like the speakers of deep truths waiting to be brought forth in this very room, he found the voice of his own calling in a form he just wasn't expecting. It caught him a little by surprise. Elijah, you see, was a follower of the Hebrew God Yahweh, and the backstory to the old story tells us that Elijah had offended the followers of another god named Baal. And so when the followers of Baal and the people of his own hometown collectively ganged up and came after Elijah for saying and doing prophetic things that made everybody else uncomfortable, Elijah did the only thing he knew how to do. He ran. He ran for his life. He went into the darkest wilderness he could find. He abandoned his prophecy and his voice and his followers and all the people who may have wanted to come with him. He abandoned his hope for a better tomorrow and his sense of purpose and his calling. And he shed his ambitions like cast-off baggage on the trail behind him. Eventually, after running for a long time, Elijah laid down under a bush to pray that he might die, for he was afraid, and he did not think he could make much of a difference anymore, and he was quite ready to go ahead and give up. He was powerless, he thought, no better than the worst of all the ones who came before him, and there was nothing but nothing for him to do when the world was quite this broken, and the problems he faced were quite this large. And as he worried, the prophet eventually fell asleep. And a voice came to him that might have been an angel or might have been a memory and told him to eat and to carry on his journey, and he did. He walked until he found a cave where he could spend the night, and he hid there. Still weeping, still hiding, still shuddering in his self-doubt, he hid there until in the darkest part of the night, a great voice that could not be ignored came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here, hiding out in this cave? What are you doing? Come out of there and stand on the mountain so you can behold the Lord." And so the old and ever new story tells us that the weary prophet got up off of his duff. He rose up, as people do and can and will again. He rose up out of his self-pity and his shame and his misery. And in time, he went out to the mountain to await the coming of the Most High and the clarity such an encounter could provide. And here is where the whole thing gets really interesting. Because just at that moment, when the prophet came to behold the great and mighty wonders of his Lord, a great and mighty wind tore through the valley and split the mountains and shook the rocks with its power. It was as if the whole world was crashing down with might and fury around him. But the wind, it was just a wind. The Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there came an earthquake that shook the ground and shattered the walls of the cave, that set the whole sky to shaking and set fire to the mighty oak trees that had stood for hundreds of years. Flames tore through the valley below, leaving embers where once the trees had grown. But the Lord was not in the earthquake, and the Lord was not in the fire. And after the wind and the earthquake and the fire, after every loud and cacophonous thing the world could throw, a hush descended over the valley and the mountain. The ashes of what had been settled silently over the stones. And in that moment there came to the prophet a soft murmuring sound like a gentle stream, a still small voice speaking somehow from within his own heart and somehow from beyond it. When Elijah heard this whisper, he knew it to be the truest voice of God, and he wrapped his cloak around his face, and he went to behold the source of all hope. For the one who calls spoke finally to the one who was quiet enough to hear. The Lord was not in the wind. The Lord's not in the earthquake. The Lord was not in the fire. The Lord was inside a whisper contained within the smallness of a quiet prayer that most of us are always too busy to hear. The Lord was within the heart and soul of the prophet himself. And when at last the Most High spoke to Elijah in her truest voice, the story does not say a dang thing about the content of God's message to the prophet. On this point, the scripture is silent. Though having pondered it for far too long, I have my theories, which we'll get to later. For now, let us say that the whisper of another prophet's calling is not for us to hear. For now, let us say that our work is to listen for a whisper of our own calling, to pay attention so acutely that we might hear the whisper of hope even when the calling comes not from the whirling world around us and its ever spinning, ever shouting, burning need, but from the quiet place below our hearts from which our own wisdom arises. And this world whirls around us, moving from one cataclysm to another, does it not? Fire and bullets and mudslides and storms, the headlines screaming of rights denied and lives threatened, and progress we thought we'd made scooting backward towards some sanitized version of the past where America only worked for the people already in possession of power. The world and its events, they whirl around us with all the force of a hurricane. The young prophets speak from high school pulpits, and they are met with insults that fly like so many sparks of flame, igniting everything in the valley below us. The pundits talk, and the children cry, and the people call out for change. And this hurricane of the world blows stronger and stronger every day, making it hard to put one foot in front of the other, let alone advance toward any agenda that matters, or to bring beauty into the corners of our lives. And here is the difficult truth. The hurricane will not stop, or it will not stop for long. The great winds will not cease to blow. The fire that burns the valley burns on, and the people who pursue the prophets will still be angry, and the ground trembles with the very force of change. It will not stop anytime soon. How then can a person dance in the middle of the storm? How then can a person hear the voice of the holy when everything around us is shouting so loudly, so forcefully, so strong? You can dance in a hurricane, Brandi Carlile's song tells us, but only if you're standing in the eye. Only if you yourself maintain the self-possession to arrive there in the middle of it all and not wither or hide or run away or fold up into fear. Only if you are there in the center of your storm, listening past the loud and crashing voices of every single thing around you and making space somehow in your own heart for the calling that does not come in a shout but comes in a whisper. You can dance in this whirling cacophony in which you find yourself. You can dance in this storm be it the world's cataclysms or the competing voices of your own immediate proximity, but you cannot hide from this cacophony. You can only dance if you show up in it and listen not only to the wind and the fire and the storm and the shouting, but to yourself. I said earlier that this story never tells us what the still small voice whispered in Elijah's ear, and this is so. I also hinted I might be presumptuous enough later on to speculate about it. And indeed, nothing in the tradition tells us anything about what the Lord had to say when the prophet was quiet enough to hear. In the whole passage, the only words the Lord is quoted as saying, other than a directive to Elijah to get up off his butt and get out of the cave, is merely this: "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? What are you doing on this cliff top, hiding in a cave, begging God to come and save you? What are you doing here, sitting, demanding miracles while the whole world swirls around you? What are you doing, being a feverish little clod of fear when your neighbors need you to show up at the center of this storm and dance?" We don't know what the whisper said. When it came to Elijah, we don't know. But sometimes I like to imagine that God just restated that challenge all over again. What are you doing here? Why aren't you out there speaking the truth you've been given to speak? Why are you entombed by your own suffering and your fear, and you cannot hear your own voice, the voice of the holy that has always been in you? What are you doing here? I like to think this is one of the Almighty's most commonly whispered challenges to all of us. Because while I do not believe in a supernatural, miracle-working God, I know how many times human beings, including myself, stuck in the darkness of a sorrowful world or a frightening life, have prayed to God or to someone beyond us to do something, anything, to send a sign, to cast a rainbow, to change our hearts, to take the guns, to smite somebody who wholly deserves smiting. How many times have human beings prayed to God to do something fabulously supernatural and make herself known once and for all in the most dramatic fashion possible? Too often people look for the holy in earthquakes and in fireworks, in military victories and in magical healings. We think that's what it means to be God, to be dramatic and speak loudly from the heavens and be able to work magic tricks upon demand. And there are plenty of stories in the Hebrew scriptures where God does seem to do just that. But not in this story, which is why I love it. In this story, God's only trick is to whisper and to force the essential question upon the prophet of every age: what are you doing here? What are you waiting for? In the gentleness of a whisper, God forces Elijah to actually listen finally to the indwelling voice of compassion. Sometimes the voice of all that is holy murmurs within you, if only you are quiet enough to hear. And sometimes the voice of the holy speaks through you, an ordinary prophet attesting to something you know to be true. Elijah came to the mountain terrified and alone, having given up on any expectation that he could change the world. He came to the mountain expecting God to work magic on him, to patch him up, to make it all better, to tell him what to do, to fix his problems and make the bad stuff go away. And when God spoke, the only message we can quote him on is, "What are you doing here?" Maybe, like me, you don't believe in supernatural, cataclysmic miracles. Maybe you don't believe that God is in the earthquake and the fire and the wind. But neither do you have to turn your back and close your ears and stop listening for the voice of the holy altogether. For after the earthquake, and after the winds, and after the fire, there comes a whisper. I pray that you might hear it for yourself. And now, as we prepare to leave this place and mingle our callings indeed with so many just waiting to share in the sacred work, let us join hands as we are willing and able for our benediction. And now, may the truth that makes us free, the love that casts out fear, and the hope that never dies